All right, welcome to the Precision Protocol series brought to you by Biocanic. In this series, where you nerd out on the world of personalized health, functional medicine, clinical research, and cutting-edge wellness strategies. We explore the advanced science, clinical applications, and the real-world impact of precision protocols designed to optimize client outcomes. This episode, we're going to deep dive into using something called AI. Not sure if anybody's heard of that. It stands for artificial intelligence. Strategically, be sure to subscribe if you're watching and listening so you never miss an episode. For those of you joining us live, we'll jump into a Q&A, but you're welcome to post those questions as we go through the discussion today. And feel free to start dropping those whenever you're ready. I am Jeremy Malecha, CEO and co-founder of Biocanic, and I am joined today by my brilliant co-host, Brendan Vermeire. All right, let's jump right in. All right, Brendan, question number one, have you heard of this term AI or artificial intelligence?
How do I know you're not an AI? You know what I mean? How do I know I'm not an AI? Am I living a simulation of my own? It's getting a little bit trippy, but all of a sudden, it's all the rage. I think it was 3, maybe 4 years ago that my Carewell rep introduced me to ChatGPT, and then it spiraled me into a whole dark night of the soul for a week. And then I was like, all right, well, I better embrace this.
Yeah. So that's the purpose today. Is we're going to have a discussion around how to leverage artificial intelligence. If most practitioners probably hear it today, they should be using AI. They don't know what to do or how to think about it. So our goal is to kind of go through exactly how to think about leveraging AI within your individual business, and then also how to think strategically about how you're going to implement that and use that to both help your practice, but then also on the flip side, really understand what's going on in this hyperbole and this hype cycle that you're hearing around AI doc in your pocket. It's going to solve all your ills. All you just need to do is just talk to ChatGPT. Mm-hmm. So to get started, I thought we talk a little bit around kind of the foundational models and then kind of dive in from there. So for those of you that don't know, Biocanic has a product called Biocanic Nexus. In that product, we are bringing out what is an agent or a Nexus assistant to help practitioners better understand their data faster and more efficiently. It's been our tagline for a long time, speed and efficiency. And so what we've been doing is really trying to understand what is going to be the best foundational model. And so when we talk foundational models, this is ChatGPT, this is Grok, this is Claude, this is all of the names that you've been hearing and all of the different media sources, but they all act and behave differently. And so what we really need to do and peel back the onion on is to dive in and figure out which one is going to work best to help our practitioners make sense of this broad-based data that they're using with individuals. So we did a head-to-head comparison. So we wanted to kind of create some guardrails around it. So we wanted to keep it very narrow so that we had a fair comparison. So what we did is we gave it reference data. The 2 reference data sets that we used were the clinical interpretive guide for the GI map and the clinical interpretive guide for the Dutch test. So we wanted to prompt it with something that was a bit outside the standard. So if we just went in and we're like, hey, we're going to ask about LabCorp blood chemistry, there's a lot of information out there. So we don't really know what the LLM is using. And so we really wanted to be specific around more of a specific case within the traditional specialty lab space within functional and integrative. And then what we did is we took my data. If anybody's ever seen me anywhere in the world, I have a gazillion GI maps and a gazillion Dutch tests. I do them all the time. And then feed that data in with it knowing about the clinical interpretive guide and then say, okay, which one performs better? So we did Claude 4.6, which is the current one. We did Gemini 2.5, and then we did Grok. And then we also did an open source version of Claude. And so when we put that data in, we said, hey, tell me about my most recent Dutch test and GI map. So think about this as a clinician working with your client. New data comes in and you're like, hey, I want to know, how does this data look relative to all the other tests that I've run for this individual? Hands down, and I know it's the favored nation right now, was Claude 4.6. So I have longitudinal data. I've been making changes. It correctly identified the newest data and the changes. And so, for example, in my most recent GI map, which my wife affectionately says was the cleanest GI map I've ever had, even though I'm a good biotic host, I have eradicated H. pylori. So my H. pylori is 0, correctly identified that, saw that most of my additional dysbiotic had actually gone down to 0, if detected at all. The only issues is really just my beneficial gut bacteria really wasn't optimal, but we know that that's kind of part of my history. Gemini was okay. Gemini and Grok kind of came in tied. They didn't really have that deeper level of reasoning and understanding to be really meaningful other than just looking at the test report itself. And then the open source or the free models just didn't perform at all. It could only look at the 2 data sets, not actually look backwards in time from that data set. So, Brendan, what questions do you have for me going through that rundown of our head-to-head competition?
I mean, just maybe a couple thousand, because it's like I in my time of playing around with AI, what I'm finding right out of the gate is the amount of time that I have to spend manually checking everything to make sure as much of it is accurate, the details. It's a weird thing because I mean, I think AI is really good, and I'm mostly experienced with ChatGPT, although I think I'm increasingly getting curious to explore Claude a little bit more. But I've been using ChatGPT for a good, 3 years, because 3-ish, however long it's been since I was introduced. And, before I really started seeing all these clips of people advising of like, well, here's how to condition and train your AI to understand what you're doing. Because I will say on a personal account level, I've poured so much time and energy and thought into it. And over the course of time, as I was getting to learn more about my AI companion, I was impressed by its ability to, recall and remember key facts. Obviously, it can retain certain like long-term memories. But I did see the complexity of like, this is like a business partner I've been working with for 5 years and understands my brain and how I look at lab results. So I definitely think there's something to be said about, preconditioning the AI, no matter what you're using. Because of course, large language models, they're great at like slamming words together in a way that like reads well. But is it accurate? Is there substance behind it? So like, for example, a lot of the content that I'll create, it's all very evidence-based, but what, like, as an example, ChatGPT sucks at is it can't generate like a list of references accurately. But if I spoon feed it, like, here's 10 references, can you please format that into AMA format without fabricating anything? It takes a little bit of like an arm twist, but it can do that. So I think especially the way that you put that of you uploaded the interpretive guide, right? This is the interpretive guide from the company. So about as strong of an instruction manual as you can get for that assay. And then having it be exclusive, like, okay, Claude or Chat or whoever, I need you to generate your answer exclusively based on this content. That's kind of how I've been operating, where I'll create these massive Word documents, maybe 600 pages of like research notes and citations and whatnot. And so then I'll upload an anonymous test result and be like, okay, I want you to interpret this, not based on maybe, let's say, the interpretive guide I got from that company, but the research that I pulled and only from this document. So that's been how I'm trying to frame it. But even then, of course, it still takes a fair amount of time to manually audit and edit to make sure it's good to go before I think about sending it to like a client or customer.
Yeah, and I think the important takeaway here is you have to know your foundational LLM, and there's a lot of different things that are coming to market pretty quickly, but you don't really know what's behind the scenes there, right? Is it a ChatGPT? Is it a Gemini? What are its constraints? What is it willing to say or not say? Because there are certain ones have certain guardrails, some are just completely, off the reservation in terms of recommendations, and that we got to prove that out. And now the question is, how do you stay ahead of that? And to your point, now all of a sudden, let's say you've put all this time and energy into kind of prompting ChatGPT to your model, and now all of a sudden you feel like, I'm getting better performance over here. How do you actually kind of think about managing that, right? Because if you put all the time into one, it's the switching costs too high to get it back trained over to what you want to say.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that. So I've been trying to, I create all these digital assets and archiving really valuable, prompts or chunks of content, or, I'll have the AI create an instructional, a list of instructions for itself that I'll save in a Word document. So that way, like, let's say I do move over to Claude or something, hopefully then I can upload all these Word documents and archives of like, learn all of this, integrate all this information. So I am not, having to start from scratch. And it's like you're dating somebody new and building a brand new relationship. So I definitely think there's that, okay, how do you archive the meaningful nuggets of content? But I guess part of me, like Jen just the other day sent me a text. She was like, oh, you'll appreciate this. Here's the prompts that I put in and what ChatGPT spit out. And it was super simplistic, but I do think the more that you train and condition the AI with, all sorts of like different research, because I wouldn't want, if I'm like co-authoring a blog or something using ChatGPT, I don't want it scraping garbage from random, unsubstantiated sites. So I try to at least like, well, let me feed it research really well. But I would like to see more kind of AI research engines as well that make even digging through research and synthesizing meaningful outcomes more effective, and have that plug in to like a large language model as well.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of really interesting things. I think really where this has an incredible opportunity at a practitioner level is really getting the information to you quicker for you to make a better, faster, more well-informed decision. I'm just kind of pulling, like I said, all my data. So I do all kinds of tests, micronutrients. We've talked about kind of neuroinflammation and everything. One of the recommendations in the consolidated analysis using the organic acids from the Dutch test was pyruvate glutamate trending upward suggests increasing glutathione demand, particularly relevant given the elevated mycotoxin burden seen on the Vibrant Wellness panel, right? So think about how quickly that connection can be made to something, that in the context, the Dutch test came in, but now it can actually connect the dot without you like having to go pick through every single historical result to try to connect the dots, right? And so there was another good example, oh boy, kynurenate and quinolinate, both mildly elevated, suggested tryptophan metabolism shifting towards inflammatory pathway rather than serotonin production, may relate to subclinical or B6 insufficiency. Great insight, actually aligns with, and we've talked about this before when we went through kind of my neuroinflammation test, looking at suboptimal tryptophan and serotonin, also being B vitamin deficient as well. So really kind of cool insights that can actually help that clinician kind of make those connections at what they've seen, and then now tie it to that recommendation and protocol.
100%. The thing is, it's interesting over the years that like, I immediately saw the practitioners pushing back, like, no, it could never do what we do. But the reality is it's really good. Like it's really, really good. I would almost describe these things as being like 95% perfect. And what's kind of ironic about it is it can so quickly and accurately synthesize what it would probably take me like a good hour of case analysis to do pretty much instantaneously. And I guess for me though, and this might be a trust thing within me, is like, I'm not yet at a point that I trust that it's going to get every little detail right. And of course I never want it to feel like it's just AI slop or junk. So then I end up spending almost as much time manually auditing and editing that I would if I just kind of did it myself. So it's one of those, it does to me speed up the volume of production. I think it increases productivity across the board. I think it can very quickly distill down to the meaningful nuggets, because what you just list out with like the pyroglutamic acid and tryptophan metabolism, those are really meaningful data points that it accurately picked up on, is giving you actionable insight. So I think there's a lot of potential. And then how does each practitioner choose to adopt that, into the workflow, right? They're plugged into Biocanic. They might be plugged into FullScript that it has its own kind of localized bot or something. And then, at what point do they integrate which platform? So I don't know. It's kind of a wacky world that I'm just trying to like keep up with as much as possible. And thinking back to, I think it was our last episode with Dr. Neil, what he was saying really stuck with me, of the multi-omics lens, because especially with some of these new advanced lab tests, like we're collecting so many different data points. You think about like the metabolomics and all these serological tests or genetic tests. That's a ton of data to try to crunch. I guess I get a little bit nervous of like, but is it going to be able to connect all these dots effectively into something congruent, I would almost need to like chat with the technician on the backside of like, hey, can you help verify that it was,
Right.
kind of connecting the right dots? Because when we start augmenting our clinical discernment with, quantities of data that we can't really sift through with our monkey mind, I mean, at what point we kind of have to just trust the machine is able to crunch all of that. So that's where I get a little nervous myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think, people, there's the term, trust but verify, but I think right now it's be skeptical and verify, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think that there's like a short-term need for that. You just got to be skeptical until you really kind of build up that confidence that you've got it in a spot where you need to be. Reminded me of Dr. Pedro from the Urban Monk. He leverages it quite a bit, spent a lot of time building out his AI agents, getting it tuned. And he still says, look, I've got it tuned. I do hundreds of patients a month. It still hallucinates. And so, it gets him 80% of the way there. So it can do an interpretation chart note in the voice of him with his typical recommendations for that given person. But ultimately, there's always that level of kind of review and oversight there.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. The other night I was playing around with, because I didn't realize ChatGPT had evolved quite a bit with image generation. I've been using Gamma is an interesting AI platform. It's very much like you dump whatever content into it, and it does a good job of trying to format the content, whether you're trying to make a carousel for Instagram or a slide deck for a presentation. It can format the information effectively. It can create its own text based on the prompt, or you can keep it verbatim. It can create all sorts of interesting imagery, but it's also very like abstract, photorealistic, like not anatomically, biologically accurate, but it's at least like, oh, that kind of looks like a mitochondria and it looks really cool. So then the other night I was playing around with ChatGPT and testing its limits. So the first diagram though that it made, I had it just make like a diagram of basically a leaky gut with, lipopolysaccharide activating an immune cell. I kid you not, it labeled it was completely textbook, anatomically, biologically accurate. And I was like, that was pretty good. Let me up the ante a little bit. And I tried having it do a more complex diagram. And that's then when it started drifting, hallucinating, generating like weird cell membranes within cell membranes. And even then, it was an interesting conversation because the language model that I was kind of communicating with was able to recognize its own mistakes, but the image generator couldn't match the brain. So the brain was like, well, I created this, but this still has multiple mistakes that we could try to correct. But no matter how many times you go back and forth to edit, it's almost like you can't overcome that hallucination. So that's the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night, and why I haven't fully surrendered or given my trust to, deep lab analysis or whatnot with, especially when we're dealing with, clinical outcomes. You don't want to make the wrong judgment. But, I'd be curious with you. You probably know more about like some of the AI platforms, like the conventional healthcare systems currently using. I'm highly curious to see, as we actually are compiling all the data and longitudinal tracking of, and I mean, that's what Nexus is doing, right? Like we're going to see correlations we would have never imagined with or noticed with the naked eye.
Yeah, I mean the AI scribe market obviously is just gone gangbusters. We integrate with Heidi Health. It's a great application. Ambient listening to a conversation in English that has rules, structure, letters, and values, and then synthesizing it, putting it into a chart note. Great application of AI in right now, and you can know, hey, did we have this conversation? Is this the actual notes? That's correct. Where it gets a little weird is now, how are we actually synthesizing something that doesn't have the rules, the structure, and the historical evidence and experience behind it, where we need to be able to say, okay, how do we think about gut-brain axis relative to toxins, relative to inflammation, all that other stuff, and put it in a meaningful way. And I think one of the things that I've seen with a lot of other platforms is they're using AI to create content for the sake of creating content. Right. So they just create this word, gigantic chart note with a whole bunch of things, not really like, who is that note for? Is it for the clinician to have all these citations and references, or is it for the end user? Because at the end of the day, the end user, if I saw a chart note or a message from my practitioner that was 25 pages long, I'm not reading that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, and I think it's weird. The art is really going to be the synthesis of making it both impactful, but also understandable.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you have kind of that Dr. Anil 5,000 different biomarkers all at once.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, like things that I think practitioners should absolutely employ currently. You can make beautiful branded materials, make your kind of templates and whatnot. So one of the things we had done this past fall with launching this mental map group program thing, well, I wanted there to be like a custom report template feature of like, okay, the first 10 pages is standardized. It's the same verbiage for everybody. But then, you know, the back half, the other 10 pages is all very customized of your results, whatnot. And so I would kind of do like a dual model of I would speak my own interpretation, and I'm literally like scrolling through the lab, talking into chat of like, I see this, I correlate it with that, da, 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 and then have it generate like a nice summary and whatnot. So you have a good package. But I will say too, to your point, I mean, with nobody wants to get dumped, you know, just page after page of it's just jarble, it's just word salad, it's fluff. It might sound good, it might read well, but there's no real substance to it. And I'm especially in a world where attention span and compliance is very much compromised. Less is more. So I'm actually finding I see more people reaching out for one-on-one services because it's like they don't trust the AI, they don't trust the algorithms, and they're like, well, I do trust you, Jeremy. So what do you think about my situation?
Yeah. And I think we've kind of talked about the empathy component, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's one thing to get a generic AI generated doc in your pocket interpretation of your comprehensive blood work from X, Y, or Z consumer. But then it's the other side of the empathy, which is the conversion of that application into something that is a human to human connection.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Well, and even just as you were saying that, I thought, you know, it's interesting to me, like when I look at some of the political stuff going on and how, let's say, a scientific topic is interpreted differently depending on the partisan belief system, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like that with AI too, where the AI will interpret it through the lens of the instructions or ideology that you're sort of pushing it to have. And that's where, you know, there's sort of this confirmation bias. And I think we as humans, we do it all the time subjectively as humans, but then the AI kind of feeds off of it. And so it's, you know, I just recently on chat, it was like, what tone do you want? Do you want warm and friendly? Do you want professional? But I remember, I think it was maybe a couple of years ago, there was this trend going on social media that was like, ask your AI to roast you. And that's really funny because then if you're deliberately asking it like to be critical or whatever the case might be, that's going to be, in my opinion, very valuable data, right? Because it's like, hey, I want you to, I'm going to pick on HTMA for a second. Like HTMA is not the most clinically validated test. I love how I'm just like, we're just going to take it there. But, you know, if I was an HTMA advocate and proponent of like, okay, I want you to interpret HTMA through the lens of believing that this is a valid test, and it'll spit that out and it'll be beautiful and whatnot, versus if I say, well, here's research that shows HTMA is not valid for assessing mineral concentration. So now interpret it through that lens. And it's like, okay, so there's, you know, no value to extrapolate here. That I think to be responsible stewards of AI, we have to push the AI to do both, to paint both pictures. So then we can use our discernment to try to blend those two together.
Yeah. Maybe shifting gears a bit, how are you using it on the research side rather than the practical application?
Yeah, great question. So like a year ago, I was doing some work with microbiome labs, and I remember I was, everything was so fast. I was working probably more hours than I ever have in my life. And one thing I really like is, like, let's say you read through a 20-page research paper, and it is very educationally enriching to truly read a full research study, even if you don't understand some of the words or some of the analytical charts and whatnot. But what's nice then is like, okay, upload that PDF to chat and be like, hey, or Claude or whoever, and say, hey, can I ask you some questions about this paper to make sure that I'm understanding, what it's really saying, what it's not saying, help me understand how they calculated this data point on this table, or, hey, I'm not familiar with this word. So that's a good way to use it. For example, there's what's it called? Consensus. It's a platform you can kind of rapidly search for research papers, all peer-reviewed, published stuff. And so then you can pull a lot of papers on your favorite topics. You could upload that as a zip or whatever into chat, and then ask like, okay, let's talk about this body of evidence with these papers I uploaded. It can be a really great way to teach yourself quite a bit and learn about new terms that you didn't know or whatnot. So that's one of my favorite ways to do it. And then of course, like with Nexus, I'm tracking individual, biomarkers in which way they're moving, but then I'll usually have those conversations with chat based on whatever data set I'm uploading, but keeping it really organized by thread, because then it doesn't go so well. Like if you're in a completely different project folder or thread. So that's where you have to be disciplined and staying organized with like, okay, this is my gut brain axis folder. And this thread, we're talking about this paper, because otherwise you'll get completely lost in the whole thing.
Yeah. So just kind of in your different conversations, being in different arenas, what's the most concerning thing that's keeping you up at night that other practitioners are doing with AI?
I have mixed feelings, because I immediately worry about exporting our clinical judgment discernment, and yet at the same time I have to acknowledge like, well, I think the AI is sharper and superior to us intellectually. Like I'm a guy that's obsessively trying to shove as much information into my neural networks as I can, but I can only do so much, and then chat just blows it out of the water with listing all these things out. So there's a mixture, I feel, of, on the one hand, I do think AI can sharpen practitioner skills a little bit. Like, let's say we have a newly graduated practitioner, and they're still learning. It's still all soaking in, whereas, the AI can kind of meet them where they're at and elevate their level of educational understanding. Because it's almost like you have to put yourself to that 98th, 99th percentile of like expertise, just to then have the knowledge to be able to tell when the AI is drifting or hallucinating or making something up, right? So that's kind of a weird phenomenon where the initial entry for a new practitioner into AI, that seems a little sketchy, but I actually think it'll help elevate that practitioner and their understanding and their knowledge. But then it hits this glass ceiling of anything beyond that, like 98, 99%, like you'd really have to, because when you think, I heard the analogy of like, AI is more educated, more intelligent than, the top 30 experts in every field of everything all the time, right? It's like, how do you ultimately compete with that? But, you think of a new practitioner that might be operating at like 60, 70%. Well, they could immediately jump up to that like 98% by assisting with AI.
Yeah. I think the challenge is you could do all of the academic study, reading all the books, and we had a joke that the most credentialed MBA had no business running a business because they had all the academic study but it had no practical business experience in my former company. And so it's one of those things where I think you can up level the knowledge base, so you remove the barrier to having to go find the knowledge, but it still takes that the understanding to be able to have the imagination to figure out where the next route is.
Yeah, I really like that commentary. That kind of expands a few things in my head, because I never really got into that show. I think it was called Suits, like the lawyer show, and but I just remember watching the first few episodes, and it's like, okay, that's a good example. If you have like the the experienced experienced advanced lawyer guy, and he's the hot shot, but then this young kid that he's super book smart, but he lacks comprehension, right? Knowledge versus comprehension versus wisdom. So some of my favorite things are, I really like just kind of philosophy in general, or even like clinical theory of like, oh, I see the limitations of this body of research. Wouldn't it be cool if, like, where's this going to go? What could we figure out? And when I ideate and sort of philosophize with the AI, that's when things get really, really interesting. And I think that can, birth a lot of great new philosophies or research ideas or legal, political, whatever it is. So, I think it's going to the AI is going to revolution is going to force us to at least try to be, the most evolved and disciplined, emotionally mature version of ourselves.
Yeah. So kind of turning this into clinical practice, how would you advise, kind of given what we've just talked about today, how would you advise a practitioner to put this into practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first and foremost is don't abandon your education thinking AI is going to solve everything for you. And I think getting really intentional about which tasks you want assistance for. I mean, there's a lot of easy, email automations and stuff like that. But I feel like this is all pretty contingent upon using a platform like Biocanic, where we're actually tracking and charting that individual's information and data. And because without that, none of it matters. Otherwise, it just becomes kind of head chatter, AI, jarble. Yeah. So if we're not rooting it with, no, I have, every email that I've ever sent to this client documented in the notes on Biocanic. I have every lab they've ever done. I can upload anonymous, make sure it's anonymous information into chat or Claude or whatever to ask the help on the interpretation or protocol design. But I think also helping it understand, I think having programming sessions where you're inputting your knowledge in the way that you think and the way you like to practice. You might have like a niche, and obviously there's going to be a difference between like, a medical doctor working with geriatric patients with neurodegeneration as opposed to like a health coach working with metabolically compromised 40-year-old women that are taking GLPs, right? But that's what's cool is I would encourage practitioners maybe think about trying to build almost like your intellectual property operational Bible, if you will, where it's like you have to kind of define your own limits and your own scope and your own methodology. Because then if you can create like a master document that then you can upload into any thread and be like, okay, I want to do this through the lens of this set of instructions. So I think maybe that would be a long way of saying inviting each practitioner to consider creating their own sort of AI manual of how they're going to integrate that into. But if they don't already define what they do and how they do it, I don't think the AI is going to complement that. I think it's going to hijack it.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the exciting, interesting things is this whole idea of kind of modeling, right? So there's the whole world of the digital twin, which I'm not really certain I really understand what that actually means. But, the idea of kind of leveraging machine learning and AI to create predictive models such that potentially being able to take cost out of the system, right? So if we can find proxy markers such that you don't necessarily, instead of having to run 5 labs, you only need to run 3. And so I don't know if he saw what I put out on Substack and LinkedIn, but we basically did a linear model looking at predicting Aura sleep score based upon the GI map, right? And we found it was super highly correlated. So I was like, okay, so I ran another GI map, and then I went out and I was like, okay, what would the model say that my sleep score would be? And it was within 0.6. It predicted it would be 84.6, and Aura had me at 84 that night. So probably coincidence, or probably overfit for me, because really the data is just trained on me and probably doesn't generalize overall. But I think the exciting opportunity is how can we actually lower the barrier, but I also don't ever think it's going to be so simple. There's always going to have to be core foundational markers that you have to understand that can't always necessarily be predicted, right? So the combinations and permutations or for 25 different markers is something, and you just do low, medium, low, normal, and high is something like 850 billion different combinations. And so I think that's where I think it's going to be, you'll see a lot more of these predictive models, health scores. I mean, we've joked about epigenetic clocks, but I think you're going to start to see a lot more of that come out.
I really like, first off, I really liked that LinkedIn post.
Yeah.
I saw it, and I liked the point that you're making. I might have you elaborate on that because, like overfitted for you, and you referenced like, early in the pandemic. And I think what you were getting as like, okay, early in the pandemic, they were doing all these predictive models to create these
Mhm.
figure statistics. Uh, but essentially you were maybe suggesting that, well, just because we can model it and create that doesn't mean it happens that way, or it's meaningful or it's relevant. Is
Mhm.
that what you're getting at when you're referring to the pandemic data or your own?
Yeah, I mean, so the issue that you have with modeling is, right, so you want to take a certain input and model a certain output. So in this case, it was Ischemia SPP for or a sleep score output. So we create the model based upon all the data, and you basically, in this case, it was just a linear regression, nothing fancy. But what happens is, if let's say you have those 25 different hormonal markers and you want to predict, I don't know, some other new kind of hormonal health, but you use all of the data to kind of build the model. What happens is you're going to get the best fitting model for all of the data that you have. But the best fitting model for all of the data you have doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for any other data that's not necessarily in that data set.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so the concept we were talking about is this idea of testing, training versus testing. Right. So you want to build the model, but you always have to validate it in the real world. And that was the challenge with, I can't remember the data set from the pandemic, but if you remember, it was like every 10% fatality rate early on. We're going to lose 1 million people in 3 months type of thing. But it was, they were tuning the data, but they had no real world output data. Right. So all it was really doing was just fitting to a growth curve. Right.
Mm-hmm.
An unfettered growth curve, because it was lacking the critical contextual information around how the virus would spread, the response, the social response, all of these other inputs that couldn't possibly be modeled, but that were mediating factors that then changed how that trajectory went. So not only was it was off by an order of magnitude, an order factor of 10.
Yeah. I can very quickly imagine how that's going to be a huge societal problem across the board for years to come. Like, we're going to very quickly enter this age of all the headlines and a lot of fear mongering, and they might even cite statistics that sort of, at least conceptually, seems like it substantiates it, and then turns out only in hindsight, right, when you actually have the real information, is crazy to think about. And so as an example of like what I'm trying to do with similar sort of predictive modeling, like with the neurolongevity index, because like the Pearl study that you guys did, that's a good example of the way that I think. I constantly am preaching, functional medicine's not functional if nobody can access it or afford it. And so I'm always like, how can we make this stuff more accessible, more affordable, especially like lab testing? I said it on Holistic Health Week earlier today, but like biomarker research in science is really my single favorite thing. And like using the neurolongevity index as an example, the 3 individual biomarkers from LabCorp that I use to then calculate the neurolongevity index, they're pretty expensive biomarkers. They're like 200 a pop, right? So it's like, wouldn't it be nice if we had a data set that showed like, oh, actually good old fashioned C-reactive protein for, $20, $15 could, predict what these other fancy novel $200 markers are. And obviously the cost will go down as technology goes down, but that's going to be the kind of thing that we see. Or even Genova Diagnostics, they have a really cool, I don't know the math behind it, how they do it, how they measure it and calculate it. But on the GIFX profile, for example, they'll show like an inflammatory dysbiosis score, which is based on their own kind of predictive modeling from their own data set of however many thousands of GIFX. So, and to me, that's really exciting because then we can take all sorts of maybe classic or accessible, inexpensive data points that are already, very solid, very well validated to then create. So like quite literally, that's what I'm trying to do with the neurolongevity index, is to attempt to make, that neurobiological scoring system a very strong validated model. And then, yeah, if we can then find a cheaper proxy that gets us to the same, end conclusion. Because otherwise, I think a lot of clinical and medical care is so restricted by the guidance of the testing and, what's insurance billable or what's affordable. And with precision biomarker analysis, like, we're in this place where we have so many new markers that are highly specific, and we can't really effectively know that this is going on without that marker. The basic blood chemistry is not going to do it, right? So how do we, use the technology to advance that? That's kind of what gets me going.
Yeah, and you kind of run into a bit of a clustering problem. And this is, so my original data engineering job way back 25 years ago. No, God, it's 30 years ago. We were doing cardiac output estimation using like an EKG, so sensors on the neck and chest. And for people that don't know, cardiac output is the amount of blood that your heart pumps out per minute, right, in liters per minute. And so it's somewhere between 2 and 12, right? Most normal people are between 6 and 8. Right. And so the algorithms originally that we were working on, based upon looking at the timing and then the pulse wave that was coming through, we could make an estimate of cardiac output. Right. And so the idea is you no longer have to go to a minimally invasive Swan-Ganz catheter to physically measure how much blood is flowing through the ventricles. The problem was it was really good and really accurate between 6 and 8. When you get to the outliers between the 2 and 4 and then the 10 and 12, it wasn't very accurate. But guess what? You don't need to be accurate for somebody who's got an average cardiac output. You really need to be accurate in the outlier, right? And that was because the clustering was so heavily weighted in the middle that we were really good and really tuned to the normal person, but we failed. And so when you think about somebody that's having congestive heart failure, their heart's not pumping, they're retaining water, the electrical fields are completely different, modified, the signal noise ratio is completely different. And so the estimates were completely off. And so at one point is essentially, and again, I picked the numbers 2 to 12 specifically because at one point you were actually probably more accurate rolling 2 dice than you were at actually using the algorithm because it was so heavily trained around normal data sets.
See, this is why we need smart data scientists, people like you. But see, one of the things I think about too, with really trying to empower and guide the client, the patient to take action, they're already so overwhelmed. So something I find myself feeling and saying more often these days is really trying to identify, and that's a lot of motivational interviewing and conversation with that client or patient, but identifying the data points, whether it's like a max VO2 or a C-reactive protein or a calprotectin for somebody with IBD or whatnot, but finding what those data points, like clinically validated, substantiated, we know, they're modifiable, they're not like abstract theoretical data points that are meaningful, that are relevant, and kind of a less is more, right? So in a world of information overload of like, okay, that pre-diabetic, gosh, I think their HbA1c and insulin levels are probably 2 of the most valuable things, that why don't we just keep it focused on that? But what then, to the conversation we're having, if we can make it mathematically defendable of like, well, yeah, but what if that one score, that composite score was, then based on the 5,000 data points that Dr. Neal was talking about. But B, you just illustrated though, and that to me, because like in the research world of, but was it statistically significant? What's the p-value, the hazard ratio, the effect size? Like there's all these little layers of nuance. One of the things I've been kind of going down the rabbit hole lately is like, do we actually have clinically validated, reliable biomarkers for nutrient status? I was kind of teasing about HTMA before, and then it's like, okay, well, so what do you use instead? It amazes me how much we don't really have it figured out with, vitamin D or magnesium. Like even RBC magnesium is not really reflective of whole body tissue levels, but it's kind of like the best we got. And my hope is that with the AI and with these machine learning algorithms, we can fully vet out like, hey, this is the thing that you really want to be paying attention of.
Yeah, and I think that's where the efficiency can come in, where you can, instead of having to run that 160 blood biomarker comprehensive blood work, you can be like, I only need 40, right? And those 40 may be expensive, but then you're actually taking cost out because the other information is extraneous or confounding that you don't necessarily need. One of the things that we looked at, just because I was curious, was we cross-correlated LabCorp blood chemistry with Dutch, right? So we wanted to look at the hormone markers, and guess what? They actually correlated really, really well. But it's Dutch's job to make sure that their proxy metabolite measurement is meaningful. But when you think about it from that perspective, there's some, a lot of challenges between doing hormone replacement therapy and you can only do serum versus, urine-based metabolites aren't going to work, but if you believe that they're highly correlated, you understand why they're highly correlated, you can eliminate one set of biomarkers from that. Yeah. So instead of the typical approach, the typical hormonal approach of doing blood, hormones, stool, food sensitivity as well, then you can actually start to pull that together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in some ways it kind of it makes me feel like I'm like a monkey with a hammer, and I'm just trying to piece it together, because the work that I did with the mental map, pre-AI for the past like 8-9 years, that was kind of what I was doing, where running all these markers together, and a lot of them very inflammatory or immunological related markers, because I was trying to find like, well, which ones are the best and the most reliable. And even with my feeble monkey mind, like we made some progress, like we identified a few things, but that's exactly it. Where now these days, I gave myself that confidence of like, I've done so many of these panels looking at all of these together. So I feel pretty confident, even without the AI data set, that, hey, this marker is going to be sufficient, because I've seen how it so directly correlates with all the others. So you can bring down costs in the long run by consolidating into that one marker. I think that might be like a good take home for the audience of, as we see more and more, statistics or data points or claims, being able to have that discernment of like, okay, but is that data point or biomarker, whatever it is, really substantial? The bio age was a good example. We kind of broke that down in like episode 1 of like, it's attractive, it's appealing, it sounds cool, but we don't actually really have the evidence to know it's meaningful. Or like peptides, everybody loves peptides, but we're not sure yet. We don't have the human evidence to know how well they really work. So that's, I think, going to be a big part of navigating the ever more sophisticated AI world that we're, rapidly plunging into.
Yeah. I think there's also a little bit of a trade-off from action too, because one of the things that always reminds me of the debate is I don't run a food sensitivity because I'm going to run a microbiome, because if they have leaky gut, I fix the leaky gut, they won't have food sensitivities. Well, the counter argument to saying that is, well, when you run a food sensitivity test, you know what to take out of the diet immediately, and you can get a win on the board quickly. And that's where it's like that. Some of the data can be tangible and have other psychological benefits.
100%, which I was hoping we might even kind of touch on that, because I was just having that conversation recently, and there was a good podcast with this guy, Dr. Mike, and then Dr. Amen. It was a really interesting conversation, and ultimately, to simplify what was like a 2-hour episode, what it kind of came down to, the sort of like point of contention and conflict, was essentially like, and they were talking about the SPECT scan, right? Because that's Dr. Amen's claim to fame, is his work around the SPECT scan. And the argument came down to like, basically, it does, using the information that a SPECT scan supplies, does it actually improve clinical outcomes compared to standard treatment? Like, does using it actually improve clinical outcomes, and do we have the randomized data to know that? And essentially, well, no, we don't. And then so it kind of positioned this argument of like, I think it's helpful to delineate between like a coaching compliance motivational tool versus like a clinically meaningful. Homocysteine is a great example of a really clinically meaningful biomarker. We know the technology, we know what it is, we know that high levels are bad and are implicated in cardiometabolic, neurodegenerative, all the things. We know it's modifiable. We know if we give B vitamins, it'll lower it, right? Versus, some other data point or functional test that we may not really have that level of clinical validation. But you know what? like a urinary neurotransmitter test would be a great example. It doesn't have established clinical utility for mental health disorders, but if that test motivates the client to like listen to you and apply themselves to the protocol and the program, then, absolutely, right? Because I would agree with that logic, right? Of, oh, well, if I, fix the gut, it would decrease the food sensitivities. But then it kind of just becomes this subjective of like, well, what's the preference or what's catered to the psychological benefit of the client or the patient, which is ultimately what we as the practitioner should be primarily focused on. And that will be highly subjective, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting. Brigham Bueller from Ways to Well was on Joe Rogan yesterday or something. And it was funny because he kind of admitted that he was wrong about AI because they had some Ways to Well bot type of thing. Oh yeah, it's going to be your co-pilot, whatever. But then he kind of basically said it's the client clinician experience that is really what's critical. The co-pilot can assist. So it was validating to hear that people are starting to see that it's a tool, it's not the solution.
Yeah. Well, everybody's embracing it in their own way. It makes me think of, for example, one of my clients near and dear to my heart that I've been working with for 5 years, OCD. Like OCD is the main thing, and it keeps her stuck in this never-ending loop of testing to find more things wrong with her, to self-pathologize, and just keeps in the loop. And so, for example, I see though, with her, the AI is becoming a reassurance machine. Just any time that she needs reassurance, it's there to kind of tell her whatever is going to feed her mind and feed her questions. So in that way, like, it's kind of pulling her deeper into a dark hole, but for somebody else, it might help lift them out of the hole, right? So I'm finding though that, to me, it feels like it's driving the clients and the patients just deeper into the rapport with the practitioner. That's kind of what I'm sensing, or that's what I'm feeling in my own practice. Because sure, all of my clients, they have access to the same AI tools, but then it just has them being like, well, Brendan, I trust you more than my AI. So what do you think? And I don't know. I keep finding like simplicity and just holding space for the person, right? But again, all the while keeping it rooted in their objective data that we should be tracking on Nexus.
Yeah. Well, maybe just as we kind of wrap up, we kind of came off the Encore event. Jeff Bland had a great talk about artificial intelligence versus artificial wisdom. I always use the quote from the Omada CEO that says, we'll leverage AI in our clinic, but that there's a reason why AI is a buzzword and artificial empathy is not. Where do you see us in a year from a clinical practical application perspective?
1 year time, I think pretty much every platform will have its own, AI plugin. Some of the companies in the space, like everybody's going to have their own individualized AI bots. But a year from now, I don't see like huge changes in a year from now. I think it's just going to be more standardized, because even in the past 1 or 2 years, I've seen it went from like AI was almost like a dirty secret of like, are you using AI? And then now it's just like, well, now it's just kind of the default, but especially with practitioners, I would imagine every practitioner is going to be like running their cases through AI. I would imagine most are already. I'm seeing some resistance as like a virtue signaling of like, well, I don't use AI, and it becomes like a morality signal. But I mean, at this point, I think the best thing is to embrace it, but learn how to use it responsibly and start crafting it and training it to be a tool that augments and enhances your unique expertise and your unique methodology, right? But I also think there's like guardrails to put in place for ourselves and our clients and patients.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm in the same camp with you. It's just AI slop is kind of hitting its peak, and I think people are more attuned to identifying AI non-original content, and there's going to be a bit of a backlash and a pullback. What I'm curious to see is, how do you create your connection and content that differentiates that it's clearly not AI. I think that is going to be something that people are going to figure out. Like it can do thinking and knowledging and speeding up efficiency and doing workflows, but then from a communication standpoint, how, I joked, I was like, at some point, does a dialect appear for human to human interaction? So think Pig Latin, right? So if all the LLMs are trained on the English language, do we actually evolve in having a new dialect such that you can delineate it from when AI is talking versus when a human is talking? That was just like a crazy future idea. But I do think, to your point, we're kind of in that downslope where we're now kind of going to that trough of disillusionment. And it's more important than ever that people really be authentic in how they kind of present themselves, but also do the overeat. The generic recommendation from the AI doc in your pocket just isn't going to cut it anymore. It has to have that level of empathy and connection.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it levels the playing field in a sense, and I think it'll stimulate more intelligent, more honest, more substantiated conversations. Like I've seen this massive rush, the pandemic accelerated it, but it went from, as a society, we didn't really think about science or talk about science or all try to strive to be scientifically literate. But then through the pandemic, I think now it's like we're all seeing that, oh, well, actually science does matter. Objectivity matters. Objectivity is kind of the light in the dark that pulls us forward. And then in a world of kind of that AI slop, I mean, word on the street of social media is like social media and Instagram use is down by, whatever percent compared to 2024. I don't even know if that's a substantiated statistic, but it resonates with me. I feel like we've hit the peak and we're on the backside, which is also why then, for example, what the type of content trending more on social media and being successful in the algorithm is like raw, camera, putting yourself out there. So to your point, it's the real authentic person behind. Because if you're just pumping out AI slop with all the M dashes, people are gonna unplug real quick.
Yeah, for sure. I think I see it quite a bit now. I even saw, I think, an ad for some product, and it was close, but the lips weren't moving quite right, and I was like, but they're going to fix that. But I think it'll be interesting to see how people start to get above the fray, such that they can get efficient, get their word out there, get their communication done, but also in the point where people feel like they are connecting with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, listen, this has been a great conversation. Hopefully people enjoyed it. We'll obviously post the replay. And then we'll be back next month in April for our next conversation. We'll figure out a super exciting topic, but always great to see you, Brendan.
Likewise, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate everybody that was here live.